Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Education Insights Legal Update webcast. This is our fourth episode of the second season. I'm Keith Bray, General Counsel at CSBA and Director of the Education Legal Alliance. In this series, we bring you top attorneys in the state to weigh in on issues you could be facing at your district or county office of education. Today, we're discussing the superintendent search process and superintendent contracts. If you can't stay with us for the full hour, we'll have the recorded webcast available on our homepage by Friday at www.csba.org. I'd like to now introduce our three panelists. First, I'd like to introduce you to Marie Nakamura. Welcome, Marie. Welcome back, actually. Marie is a shareholder at Chronic Moskowitz, Tiedemann and Girard. Her legal areas of expertise include education and labor law. She has also substantial experience with administrative law and served 3 years as a neutral regional attorney for the Public Employment Relations Board. Marie is also a certified mediator with experience facilitating settlement conferences. We're glad to have you here again today, Marie. Also joining us today is Roy Combs. Welcome, Roy.
Thank you, Keith.
Roy is a partner at the Oakland and Sacramento offices of Fagan, Friedman, and Fullfrost, where he serves as the co-chair of the Governance and Leadership Practice Group. In this capacity, he keeps the firm's legal staff and its clients up to date on legislative mandates and advises on appropriate roles of governance teams. Roy has extensive experience in certificated and classified labor negotiations and assists districts with claim and risk mitigation and litigation. Previously, Roy served as the general counsel for the Oakland Unified School District. Thanks again for being here.
Good
Roy.
to be here. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Last but not least is Dr. Steve Joel. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you,
Steve
Keith.
is here all the way from Lincoln, Nebraska. He's an executive board member at McPherson and Jacobson, a nationally acclaimed search firm that is a partner with CSBA. Steve has served as lead consultant on many superintendent searches across the nation. A lifelong educator, he brings his career as a teacher and coach. After becoming principal, Steve also served in the capacity of superintendent for over 20 years in Kansas and Nebraska, and is currently serving as superintendent with Lincoln Public Schools in Nebraska. Thanks again for joining us today, Steve. We're also happy that you're here. So this afternoon, we'd like to, with this panel, who have years and years of experience in working with superintendents, working with school boards, in negotiating their contracts and conducting searches for superintendents for their districts. We're going to go through the process of what it is like to conduct a superintendent search, negotiating these contracts, working with boards, working with communities. We know this is about the right time for this discussion to take place. Superintendents, many are either retiring or have accepted positions, perhaps at other venues, and we're now in the process of beginning to fill the most important job in the district, and that's the CEO, the superintendent that leads the ship. The boards are our governing leaders, and we see superintendents as the leading manager of the school district. So what we're going to do this afternoon is work through a few questions in a very much of a round table format, where we'll be looking at issues from start to finish with the superintendent search and contracting process. The first question that I'm going to put to the panel is this. It's March 11th, and you found out your superintendent is no longer going to be leading the district in the coming school year. What happens next? Marie?
Well, first of all, we hope that it's not March 11th and you're finding out that your superintendent will be here. In a perfect world, you'd have more lead time than that, because most superintendent contracts do expire at the end of the school year or the end of the fiscal year, which would be June 30th of any given year. So hopefully you have a little bit more notice than that. But once you do get notice, the board needs to meet. There needs to be meetings both in closed session and in open session to determine what steps to take next. In closed session, their discussions end up being about, what kind of a new leader might we be looking for? What do we like about the former superintendent? What might we be looking for in a new superintendent? And also there needs to be initial discussions with the community about next steps and whether the district itself, whether the board is looking to use its own HR department to run a search or to hire a consultant to bring in to run the search. And a lot of that is dependent upon the culture of the district itself, as well as the board and the size of the district.
So let's focus on that. This is an opportunity where a school board and the district has worked, let's say, for several years with a superintendent, and now there's this opportunity that's created by what's a pending vacancy. How important is it to really look at retooling? How important of it is to take a look at where you've been and now where do you want to go?
I think it's really important, Keith. Quite often a school board that hired a superintendent is not the school board that's working with the superintendent, and that oftentimes leads to a vacancy. And I agree with Marie. I think March 11th is significantly late in the process and probably going to lead a district toward an interim placement. But in terms of working...
So what's optimal?
Well, most superintendents have a pretty good idea that they're either going to be in the market, and they'll inform their board in advance of that, or they'll offer a resignation/retirement October, November, December, which gives the board then optimal time to go through a comprehensive search process. One of the things that we always worry about in the search side of the equation is that if we're starting too late, it has a tendency to be a rush job. And if it's a rush job, then one, the applicant pool is diminished, and two, sometimes we don't make the right match, and we shouldn't make a match. So interim superintendencies right now across the country are vibrant opportunities for people to get one more year. But in terms of retooling, whether a district chooses to work with a search firm or with themselves, it's really important to take a look inside your district and outside your district, internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, and ask the question, what's gone well, what hasn't gone so well, and what's the future focus of the district going to be. And a good search consultant will guide that process. But there's a lot of districts that can do it themselves too, as Marie alluded to. So obviously a great opportunity to retool, and things do change even in 2 or 3 years, given some of the current politics in a district.
And Keith, in addition to that, I agree 100% with Steve and Maria. If it's March, it's a little late, so maybe the first advice, not legal advice, is stay calm.
There you go.
But beyond that, I think it's also important to look at because it's an opportunity to retool in that area. I think Steve was talking about the broader retooling that can present itself as an opportunity when there is a transition in the leadership. But sometimes it's also important to look at that contractual relationship as well and survey the board. It's typically going to be the board that you want to ask questions about what worked and what didn't work with this contract. And that may be separate and distinct from who that candidate is that's coming in, and separate and distinct from who the superintendent that's going out. So it presents those opportunities.
So you see it as an opportunity
Absolutely.
to really focus then on the existing contract and help that become a tool to have a conversation as to what might the new contract look like and what maybe are some of our goals and objectives that weren't in these.
That's right. I think that should be a parallel process. It really should begin right when the board learns that they're going to look for a new superintendent, because it presents that unique opportunity. Oftentimes, the contract isn't looked at until the tail end, and sometimes it's a little late.
So where do these discussions take place? I mean, it's a governing board. We're subject to open meeting laws.
We're subject, and the conversations about the contract itself as they apply to the current superintendent would occur in closed session. And I would also, piggybacking on what Roy said, also look at the evaluation for the outgoing superintendent, because there may be goals that were laid out in that person's evaluation that might be something that the board wants from the new superintendent. They can use some of the aspects of that evaluation, the goals of the district and how the superintendent is achieving them or helping to achieve them as kind of guideposts for looking for a new superintendent.
Prior to a board going out to the marketplace, they need to have a good understanding of the contract. And one of the things that we run into all the time, and I know you both agree, is that boards don't take the time to study what's in that contract, and that becomes problematic near the end of a tenure. So as a search consultant, that's one of the very first things we do when working with a board is we say, do you know what's in the contract? We spend time reviewing that with them, with legal counsel, and make sure that this next contract is going to be something that this board and community is going to support.
Mm-hmm. And I agree. The other piece, too, that I think, following up with what Maria said, is to look at what the board's current LCAP is. we're in this new world now, and it's very new for us, for all of us. But that LCAP has been through a very strenuous vetting process. It includes all the stakeholders of the district, and in some ways should really reflect some of the goals, if not the critical goals and objectives that the board has in its search process, and that the board ultimately might want to embed in its contractual relationship when it looks at duties and responsibilities beyond the legal duties and responsibilities. So that's another area to begin to think about, how those primary LCAP provisions may work their way into the search process and ultimately into the contract as well.
And these initial discussions, talk a little bit about the board's consideration of how they're going to conduct their search process. Was it a professional firm? Is it going to be, you mentioned the HR department? I know county offices get involved. What are some of the pluses and minuses of?
Well, I think one of the pluses of using a firm is it's turnkey, and we have a great McPherson Jacobson has a great relationship with the School Board Association here in California, as we do other associations around the country, and we've got a lot of experience working with boards, working with legal counsel in terms of setting the framework to conduct a comprehensive legal search that yields the very best applicant based on the criteria that the board and the community have vetted in terms of what it's going to take to be successful. But that doesn't mean that you can't conduct a search by yourself, and in fact we see that frequently around the country. But if you don't have experience with that search process, particularly the vetting of candidates, that's where search firms earn their money, is really getting deeply into who that person is and what they're representing, because everybody looks alike on paper right now, and quite frankly there's an awful lot of folks out there that are trying to get superintendencies that might get one in March 11th or April 11th because the candidate pool is so low, but in reality wouldn't get past a search firm. But good HR people know that process as well too.
What has been your experience?
Well, I believe strongly that professional consultants should be engaged by the board. There's so many considerations. Some districts do a very good job in succession planning. They have internally lined up the candidate public. The board is aware of that. But even there, bringing in external consultants, professionals to help can be important, because it can validate for the entire community that internal candidate really is the best person for the job. And I think the search consultants allow the board to have a broader perspective. Sometimes boards, and even we as lawyers who are working with districts, can become very insular, looking at just the dynamic within that particular district. So having the consultants give a marketplace analysis, look at what the real talent pool is out there, can be important. And then boards listen to the external consultants as well. So I think it's critical to bring that professional expertise in.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. One, the internal candidate, I would take it to be your support, your consensus that even with a good internal candidates, that boards still conduct a search.
Most definitely. I think that, and it's similar to what Roy said, that we are familiar to our school boards, right? The lawyers are familiar, the administrators are familiar, and they may think someone is an ideal candidate for that particular position, but there may be someone just down the road or just over the mountain who would be actually a much better fit and bring ideas to the district that hadn't been vetted before. And so I think that you kind of have to do both. And going back a little bit to what everyone was talking about with regards to using a search firm versus using internal, I think there needs to be a balance of both, only because the complaints that I've heard from clients about search firms is that those firms don't necessarily understand the client itself. Where HR might understand the client, may understand the stakeholders and that type of thing, they may not have a statewide or national perspective on potential candidates. So even if you bring in a search firm, I think it's very important that HR and some of the other administrators be involved, at least in helping educate that firm as to what that particular district needs.
Has that been your experience? You rely upon the local knowledge?
Yes, without question. But it's incumbent upon a good search consultant to learn as much about that local culture as possible, because it is about ultimately making that match. With respect to the internal candidate, I would say that's an interesting situation in a couple of ways. One, boards very much validate the process, particularly if an internal person receives a nod, when they go through a comprehensive search process, and that individual gets vetted then by internal and external stakeholders, and there's ownership when that person comes in. So it isn't something that was handed to them, which creates questions in a lot of people's minds. However, when conducting a national search, one of the very first things that quality candidates, and Marie was talking about over the mountain or across the river, or, people who are sitting superintendents that might have an interest in a particular position, one of the very first questions they have is there a strong internal candidate? And, we have to be honest with those folks too, but we also say, life's about competition, and if you're as good as you think you are, and you look to be, then don't be afraid of the competition.
So why don't you share with us the scope? Just reference to Marie's statement about being able to go and there'd be somebody in another district close by, and then you just mentioned national search. Well, what are the scopes of searches generally for
Well,
superintendents in California?
we establish a relationship with a board. We typically ask them, are you interested in doing a national search or a regional search? Most boards outside of big urban centers in the country are very interested in regional searches. And, I think a large percentage of candidates ultimately come from the state in which, we're doing the search. But, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we advertise well and that we recruit well for this particular position, and we bring the best talented pool we can to a Board of Education, who ultimately has to make that decision.
Now, going back to this notion of local knowledge, as Marie was mentioning, really playing a strong role in the search process when there's a professional search firm. Give us an idea. I mean, all three of you have been involved. How long are these searches typically? How long do they typically take? That is to say, how much time does a professional search firm have to come in to get an understanding of the culture of the community and the board that they're going to be serving?
Well, I'll kick that off. If we could get 3 months, we could do a great job, but that's not always possible. Depending upon timing and depending upon what the talent pool is. More than likely, it's 2 months. And, where we learn about the culture is boots on the ground, however many days it takes to meet with as many groups as the Board of Education is designated to be involved in the process, ranging from students to business to parents to staff, both certified and classified. So that's really how, the consultants are learning about their culture and finding out the strengths and the weaknesses of this particular position that ultimately will be shared with the board. It's kind of a focus group, some data collection for them to understand how people are perceiving their work, but it's also very valuable for the candidate that's thinking about coming to that position.
So let's talk about that length of period that you're experiencing.
Well, I would agree, and if it's less than 60 days, I'm not sure how robust the process can really be, particularly if it's occurring at the tail end of the fall season with the various holiday breaks, etc. But I think the real issue is when is this vacancy occurring? What's the lead time that the board has? Is the board entertaining an interim appointment? March 11th, 90 days just isn't going to hit it if someone wants to be on the ground and in the district July 1. So those considerations have to be discussed, and the board has to be real candid about what their objective is in the search process. I mean, something less than 60 days is not likely to produce a very good process for that particular board.
So let's talk a little bit about what happens then during the search process. We now have, regardless of the timing of the notice from the superintendent, and our questions or our discussion days primarily when it's voluntary. And as we go through this process, we'll eventually end up with the question about, well, what happens when it's involuntary? Does that change any of the significantly change any of the topics that we're going to talk about? But what happens during the search process? Where do we start? I mean, we've decided whether it's going to be a professional search firm or it's going to county office. Somebody's going to handle this for the board. The board's not going to do it themselves, right? The superintendent who is retiring, she's not going to be doing it herself. Well, what do you guys have, off the top of my head, what do you see as the role of the superintendent who might be retiring or leaving the district in the new search? What is
Stay out of the process.
Stay out of the process.
Oftentimes, the outgoing superintendent is asked to facilitate the process.
Facilitate the process?
That's not uncommon.
I think in most cases the superintendent should try to stay out of the process, maybe give some insight to the board as to what worked with his or her relationship with that particular board and what might work with a new superintendent. But superintendents are selected for their positions because they are very good leaders and like to be in charge. And sometimes it's hard to put that same person in charge of finding their replacement.
But I think you raise, Roy, a very good point, that there's this reliance over time with the superintendent that's been there and has helped work with the board as part of the governance team and gone through perhaps some very emotional experiences with the board and has that bond. That's who they're going to turn to, right?
Well, oftentimes that's the case. Of course, it's situational, but in our scenario where this is a voluntary departure, someone is at the end of their career, it is not uncommon that outgoing superintendent is asked to facilitate. And that can be that's a reality. We see that on the ground, and that's where search consultants can give some advice. And we oftentimes attempt to give some advice to insulate the outgoing superintendent from that process. Someone, whether it's the HR assistant or someone else, act as the facilitator.
So but let's focus on that for a moment. The role of the district's own legal counsel in this process, in the search process. What have you found it to be in your experience over time?
Well, occasionally it's, I would call it coordination. But it can include a variety of different things. Typically, there will be the review of the search consultant's contract itself. It will include some review of the milestones in that contract. Sometimes a dialogue with the board about the milestones and the timing as it relates to that contract. And early on, we should encourage the board to take a hard look at the contract, the superintendent's contract that they anticipate with the incoming superintendent. Begin the evaluation of what worked, what didn't work with that contract. So that then migrates into this role of really coordinating the process.
You've been through several superintendent changes and searches. What's been your role?
It's very similar. I mean, there's the legal parts of it, what can and cannot be in a contract, that type of thing. But there is a lot of consultation and some counseling that happens where you may need to remind the board how you selected the previous superintendent, why the current contract says what it says, conflicts that may have arisen under that contract over the last several years, and suggestions for modifying that particular agreement. That it's that type of interaction. Also, as we move further down the process, there are the conversations with regards to what should or shouldn't be asked during an interview. And some of, when you're working with a consultant, they oftentimes provide at least base questions to be asked. But sometimes the attorney who's been working with this particular district for a while will know that certain board members will have pet projects or ideas that they want to vet with superintendents. And sometimes you help them draft those types of questions so they meet all the standards of the law. And then there's also helping with the interviews themselves, making sure that they're set up, that they're agendized properly and all of that.
How have you utilized district legal counsel and combine that with utilizing the superintendent and her staff?
Once we establish a contract with a board, we then reach out, or the attorney, legal counsel will reach out to us, and we'll learn some of the nuances of exactly what has already been described. But we have to have a good relationship with the legal counsel. And legal counsel typically have been with the district for a large number of years, so they have some of the insider information that can really help us, particularly working with the board and community groups. And then the closed session, open session, as we work in different states around the country, the rules are different in all the states. We oftentimes tell boards to let the superintendent, in a voluntary separation situation, to be a point person for us when we bring candidates in. In other words, they can conduct the tour. We'll if it's a good situation, we'll typically have the superintendent spend an hour with the candidates when they come in. But we don't want them getting involved in the process. And honestly, we don't want the internal staff to be overly involved either, because what happens is superintendents have egos. And if they've done a good job, they're worried about what it looks like when they leave. And it's very difficult for them to differentiate between what their role is and how they'd like to see this district proceed. And we've seen, again, across the country, where that will get things confused pretty quickly. So we're pretty upfront with boards. Give us folks to work with, but let us run our model, and you'll have a better result.
So regardless of the timing, and especially if it's involuntary, but with the voluntary, say it's a late notice like we've discussed on March 11, or it went through the typical process of perhaps October, November when decisions are being made. Does that, regardless of the timing, what does it generate with the school board? Do you find that it generates just this level of instability that then permeates throughout the process, and an anxiety of not having their leader for the coming school year? How do you handle that?
I think it really is district dependent. I think districts that have been stable have had stable leadership, particularly if this is anticipated in some way. They'll get through it. There won't be panic. There won't be stress. Maybe some anxiety about the process, nevertheless. But it really is district dependent. Other districts that have struggled, if they've been in the paper a lot, which is not for the best things, it can be a torturous process if there's a lot of community input and criticism of either the board or the superintendent. That can make it a much more difficult process. And in this era of transparency around executive contracts, the board has to very, very carefully decide how it's going to proceed depending on its own unique situation.
So let's talk about community involvement. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, my point was just that it's incumbent, I think, in those instances that you have a really strong board president, and that I know that CSBA offers trainings and there are model policies and those types of things that will help people at least know that there are processes in place for replacing superintendents, and that the board needs to come together in those circumstances to work towards a new goal. And I've seen many superintendents come and go in different districts over the years, and I've never seen it be a situation where the school board wasn't able to bring it together and move forward.
And bring themselves together.
Bring themselves
You mentioned
together.
at the beginning, Keith, that this is the single most important task that the school board has. What we find is even in boards where they're concerned and they're wondering how they could possibly go on without their superintendent, they will come together around their person. It's the dawn of a new era.
Roy, you mentioned the LCAP and how now we're in the second year of developing the update to the LCAP that was approved and adopted by the board the previous year, and how that required stakeholder involvement. Is that going to have an impact on contracts or these vacancies with superintendents, and how much the community members or staff members or students may be involved in helping to at least help describe or define what the characteristics should be for the new leader?
Well, I think it will. I'm already aware of a couple of districts that are actually looking at their LCAP in anticipation of a leadership change and thinking about how that gets embedded in the process, in the recruitment process. How extensive that becomes, I don't know, but at least a couple of districts are already beginning to think about that. I think time's going to tell ultimately.
Good.
That's okay. And one of the concerns that I've seen in the last year or so is when we do talk about bringing in potential superintendents from outside of the state of California, is there's an educational process where they need to even understand the LCAP, and so that then they can understand why school districts are consulting with these different parent advisory groups and district, English language advisory commissions, and all of these different groups that might have input into bringing in a new superintendent. A lot of folks coming in from out of state aren't necessarily as familiar with kind of the local control aspect of our new funding formula.
Well, has the LCAP had an impact on salary comparisons? We know that it's had an impact on the funding, but it's not done the way it was done in the past. We now have grants. What is it that's now happening in the superintendent sector with salary comparisons that boards are going to rely upon?
I haven't seen the LCAP impact that yet, but I think currently we have much more scrutiny around superintendent contracts and executive compensation throughout the state. We can likely go all the way back to the city of Bell 3.5, 4 years ago that have shined a light on all executive contracts. So I think there's simply that focus now on how much superintendents are compensated, what's within that compensation package. Our board's trying to bury compensation through various allowances, etc. And I think there is just this notion that transparency around those compensation packages has to be at the premium level of disclosure now.
So professional firm comes in, we know you're going to be doing salary comparisons, but it doesn't and you mentioned it earlier, and the supply and demand, the availability of superintendents that are in the marketplace, has that impacted superintendent searches?
Oh, yes, and it's impacted superintendent compensation around the country too. And a lot of that is driven by what are the challenges inherent in a particular school district. You know, if it's a district where there's an involuntary separation and morale's at an all-time low and, you know, board members are being voted out, then, you know, that obviously the price is going to go up a little bit in terms of the candidates that are looking at that. You know, but I can tell you what I'm seeing around the country, and that is much greater transparency in superintendent contracts. And I know some of the superintendents listening to this are probably not going to agree with that because there are a lot of perks that oftentimes go totally unnoticed, even by boards themselves, because boards change with every election. But the more transparent a contract is, the more acceptance there is ultimately. Now, there's always shock and awe when that number is rounded up because it's not being separated or hidden, or, you know, there isn't a number, it's just a lot of words in a contract. But the reality of it is people do appreciate that transparency and they can defend it. And the other thing I'd say about contracts with respect to boards, you know, we work with boards again all over the country, but there'll always be a board member that thinks, okay, somebody's leaving after 20 years of experience. We ought to be able to bring in somebody at a lesser level of compensation because they don't have near the experience. And what we always say is pay the position and hold that individual accountable to produce what your outgoing superintendent is producing. And then our job is to make sure that we don't bring in candidates that the board falls in love with, community falls in love with, and they want 20% more than what the salary range is. So again, would be an argument for some of the work that we do as a search firm.
So I think we've touched on it. Just the segue is this question: what should be the objective of the new contract with the superintendent? And we've talked about the transparency, and I know in our discussions before this afternoon, the importance of clear, upfront understandings of what both parties want.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, it's a bilateral agreement, so we have to remember that this is a contract between the board and the superintendent.
Negotiated.
It's negotiated, that's right. So this is a two-way street. But that clarity about expectations, both the expectations of the superintendent and the superintendent's expectations of the board, are very important to be clearly articulated in that agreement. Of course, there are a long list of provisions which we can talk about, but there are a long list of contractual provisions that should be embedded. But it's clarity around expectations ultimately that should be embedded in that contract.
And what's the result if there's not? I mean, you've experienced that, right? What's the result? How long do those contracts then stay in place?
Well, the contract may be there, but the relationship can become soured, and that's what we don't want. We don't want a sour relationship, and it will manifest itself in lack of understanding around what evaluation outcomes there are, what the real objectives were of the board when they hired this person. It can lead to a bad relationship, which is exactly what we don't want.
Well, and I think what happens is when March 11th or whenever the previous superintendent decides he or she is going to leave, the board goes back to look at the contract, which they may have not looked at for 3 or 4 years longer than that. And they're focused at that point on the provisions of the contract that have to do with termination and salary, right? And otherwise, they probably haven't thought much about this contract over the period of time that's been in effect. And so as a school lawyer who's working with the board to come up with a fair contract that a new superintendent wants to enter into, I always feel like I need to go line by line, not literally line by line, but section by section through that agreement with the client to say, okay, this is why this is here. This defines the roles, say, of the administration versus the role of the board. This paragraph is in here so that complaints that come to board members are somehow formulated and made sure that they get to the superintendent. Because board members don't necessarily even look at those sections of the agreement because really they are concerned mostly with how do we hire them? If they're leaving, can they really leave us like this? How much are we paying them?
So security is a big thing, and now direction in contracts. Is this the place and the time to put in performance objectives?
Absolutely, and we do that as part of our model. We work with a board, and it's part of our guarantee that this individual is going to be there for a couple of years to develop mutual performance expectations. And we typically do that 30 days, 60 days after the commencement of the contract. And we come in and it's the board and the superintendent only. We don't really want anybody else to be there.
So you don't do it before the
No. But we encourage superintendents to get into the contract that in fact mutual performance expectations that can lead
Will be
to
established.
performance-based evaluation will be part of the commitment the board's going to make and the SUP's going to make. And then we also, we come back in and we work with boards of education. We call it operating principles. And that, I think, is what Marie and Roy were alluding to. And that is that how are you going to govern the relationship? What are the do's and the don'ts? How are you going to communicate effectively with each other? How are you going to handle concerns? What's going to happen when somebody comes to you with a
So
personnel
wasn't
issue?
it easier? Wait a minute. Wasn't it easier when it was vague and ambiguous?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Wasn't it a lot easier?
Well,
There's a lot more vacancies.
and I think internally there can be a lot more tension. And I think what we're trying to avoid is tension. Going back to the LCAP, I think the LCAP actually gives an opportunity to have clear performance objectives worked into either the contract in advance or within some window after the contract is executed. Because we know the direction the district is committed to go. The board has made that determination, they're enacting that LCAP, and they're moving forward. So the new leader should certainly understand that.
So let's spend some time on the terms of the new contract. What should board members focus on the most? Because when you focus on terms, as you all have discussed, you're focusing on the relationship. You're focusing on the expectation. You're focusing on what may be the public opinion, which now, because of transparency, really rules the roost. So what are some of the terms? I mean, obviously compensation, and I think you've mentioned that. That means total compensation now, right?
That's right.
So these terms of your experience, that's board members will focus primarily on compensation?
They focus, I don't want to say primarily or exclusively on compensation, but it is a large focus. And boards becoming more and more sophisticated after the City of Bell and other instances where it used to be that they didn't, although it was laid out clearly in the contract, for example, how much the base salary was, what the contribution to health benefits was, the auto allowance and all of that. They never asked, 5 years ago, I never had anyone ask me, what's total compensation? But in part because we're talking to unions about what is total compensation, boards are more sophisticated, they want total compensation. So now I think it's incumbent on those of us working with districts and during these negotiations to tell the board what the annual total compensation is for any given contract. I think that's very important to them. Also for boards, they want they want some commitment from that new superintendent that he or she's going to be there for the next 4 years. And usually on the other side, the superintendent wants the same thing. Occasionally you have a board, though, that maybe their person that left on March 11th didn't leave on the best of terms. They may decide, term is really important to us too. You're
2
lucky we're going to
years.
give you 2
Yeah.
years.
Yeah, right.
You know, so those are the two things I think that boards immediately will focus on.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about the term and in today's, in California especially, this notion of the Evergreen contract that rolls over. It's changed over time, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, AB 1344, another Bell outcome, certainly changed that. So they're not prohibited, but any increase can't exceed the COLA based on the DI, the Department of Industrial Relations statewide COLA. We also have other procedural requirements as a result of AB 1344. All contracts have to be approved or renewed in a regular meeting. It can't be a special meeting. And there are other requirements. But the landscape has changed in that regard. You know, there are a number of terms, I think, as Maria was starting to explain, that are key. And you know, we've talked a lot about those performance objectives, the goals and objectives. And I think boards are getting more sophisticated now around those provisions in the contract. And I think at least I'm beginning to see a more robust discussion around it. Maybe that's one of the consequences of the new statutory scheme that we have in place.
Are you finding the Me Too clauses, are those in contracts now as much as they were in the past with respect to when the bargaining union gets an increase, superintendents get that increase?
You know, I'm seeing less of those. I don't know that.
I'm seeing some of them, and as we come out of the recession, over the last few years, just as we were coming out of the recession, the Me Too language was not only would the superintendent get the same increase as Management Confidential, type folks or the administrators, but he or she would also get the same decrease. But I think we are seeing fewer of those. And I do think we will be seeing more performance-based incentives financial incentives moving forward.
Boards are very interested in performance-based compensation because it's a great way to be accountable to the public. And so, we're seeing a lot of that, and they at least want to discuss it, but I think there's some limitations in California that might prohibit that with respect to what that overall increase looks like.
Well, and with that being said, are the Evergreen Clauses from this point forward being negotiated into contracts as much as they used to, or is there some backing away from? I mean, Evergreen means you're binding, to some extent, you're binding future boards.
That's right.
You've got a contract that goes on and on and on unless something happens. And so what are you finding in that regard?
Yeah, well, I think the Evergreen does bind future boards. It also creates a limitation on contractual increases based on performance. So I haven't say I've seen fewer Evergreen provisions just yet, but I think as boards, we'll have to see what happens. But I think as boards start to look more carefully at performance, there may be less incentive to pursue Evergreen.
And I agree with that. I think that definitely we're moving away from the Evergreens and more toward the 1 or 2 year contracts that stipulate what the goals and objectives are, and those are evaluated accordingly.
So beginning January 1 of this year, STRS regulations went into effect with respect to what additional salary in a contract for a certificated employee can be counted towards earnable or creditable compensation. You have districts and county boards, they've been given a year to negotiate for those that have contracts that have what we've been talking about, some of these expense features. Have you been involved yet in negotiations or discussions with superintendents about what to do? Because as I understand the regulation is that this is a year period in which what previously have been allowances or cash allowances can in fact be put into the salary, the compensation that would be credible as long as you do it between now and December 31.
That's right, without a spiking audit.
Without a spike, without a spiking, right. So have those negotiations begun to take place?
Candidly, I haven't had any negotiations. There's been talk in a few districts, but I think some districts are looking at, do they leave it alone? Or do they roll it in? And I don't know. I mean, I think that's going to turn on particular contracts. Was there a large cash in lieu provision, for example, that they'd want to roll into compensation? Every once in a while we see contracts where there's a cash provision and that superintendent buys his or her health benefits, for example. That could get rolled in, and that could be 20 grand, something like that. But so far I haven't actually negotiated any.
I've, over the last couple of years, because STRS, before this law went into effect, started trying to enforce it, in my personal opinion. And so they were saying things that had traditionally been considered compensable under the STRS regulations, under the STRS statute, things that could be rolled into salary. They were questioning that on superintendents who retired in the last few years. And so the last couple of agreements that I've worked with have been very careful how benefits are paid and what other allowances might be given, just because I have to explain to the board that there's an expectation or a probability, and now it's an actual law, that STRS is taking a different look at how these people are paid.
And hasn't STRS also backed off on making payments on behalf of the employee, the employer actually picking up both the employer share and the employee share? And doesn't that at some point start with all contracts? And what is it, 2016?
Well, I think it may be 2016. I think it's a temporary suspension of that requirement, but long term, I'm actually not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
And that's one of those that's one of those things that really causes problems on the back end of any relationship too. When a public discovers that in fact their retirement was never really reported publicly, but it was being compensated by the Board of Education, ultimately by the community. And so one of the things that we recommend is don't do that. I mean, that's just asking for trouble.
Also has a little impact on the staff who are
Most definitely.
making their own contribution. That goes without saying. So evaluation. We mentioned that you mentioned that maybe 45 days after or thereabouts is a good time then to sit down and just not talk about performance objectives, but also how to evaluate. What's been your experience in terms of board members actually conducting the evaluation, and number two, what's been the successful evaluation procedures?
If boards are attending CSBA training sessions and taking it seriously and diligently, they're doing a pretty good job with it. They understand what the law requires. But too often we see that, in fact, once the hype of the new superintendent coming in is gone and work goes on, that they lose interest in it, and they have to be reminded. And good legal counsel will remind the board that you have to do this statutorily. But in all honesty, that first year is really about the 2 or 3 or 4 things that emerge through the superintendent search. Maybe it's develop positive working relationship with internal staff, and maybe it's be a better representative for us, this district in state and local politics, work on the budget, address the opportunity and academic gap, and those are really pretty easy goals. Year 2, year 3, year 4, they become a little bit more specific because now they've taken care of the overarching issues.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100% with Steve on that one. One thing that I would say that at least I see even today, is the evaluation cycle itself is out of sync with almost every other major activity in the district. And that's, fine contractual provision, but at least getting that in sync is helpful. And I think there, again, under LCFF, under LCAP, there's a clear timeline, and performance can be tied to what.
So what would bring it into sync?
Well, I think now what we would want to do is have the evaluation lined up with the LCAP process. Okay. At least that's would be my recommendation.
I would add one thing to that. Evaluation shouldn't be a one-time event. Shouldn't just occur, as a singular issue or event. It really ought to be ongoing conversation between the superintendent and board of education. One of the things that we try to recommend when we're working with the board is have a pre-evaluation conference in November, December, mm-hmm. and talk about any issues perhaps that that need to be worked on, and then do the formal one based on what statute requires.
Now, in California, termination and termination severance. If you read nationwide materials, this is a big issue, but we've pretty much taken care of that with our statutory scheme with respect to the 18-month clause, right? Are you finding that, and I find in some of the contracts that I'm reading, that's almost a given that it's 18 months. And what CSBA will be doing over the next couple of months is developing a sample contract for its governing boards to use. I know that the Administrators Association has theirs. Now there'll be a sample contract, and with a narrative that very clearly will say, hey, 18 months that's the exterior. It's your discretion is what's comfortable. What are you finding the severance, Marie, the severance clauses to look like?
Well, for the audience, just so that everybody's on the same page, it is 18 months or what's left on the contract. And so if you only have 12 months left on the contract, that would be the maximum amount
but
of
you
severance.
Bargain in even the 18?
Right.
I mean, that's
and what I've seen in districts, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, especially as more of this has become public and how much people are paid out, and they're getting paid out from one district and then moving on to another district, that the maximum amount has been decreased, even though the statutory maximum is 18 months. I have drafted contracts with 6-month provisions and 12-month provisions, because to clients that seems more than fair to pay someone an extra year of salary in order to get out of the contract.
So not only is it the optic of having 18 months, right, but it's also then, if it's in the contract, it then sets, and there is more than 18 months left, then it then sets that whole negotiation. Right. If you just narrowed it down to a 6 or a 12 month.
Exactly.
Is that what you're finding?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Have you ever run into a situation, because the expiration of the 45-day rule is a pretty harsh result, right? Mm-hmm. You want to comment on that?
Well, it can be. So it really depends, one, on timing. But, I think what can happen is that if there's a shorter time period, whether it's 6 or 12 months, it avoids some of the problems that we have with the 45-day notice provision.
And that provision provides that it just rolls over in whatever the term was.
And they have a new term.
By the end of the term, if you haven't given notice within 45 days, if it was a 3-year deal, you get another 3-year deal.
That's right.
Yeah. So but there are markers in every contract, right?
Absolutely.
That helps with
there should be
superintendent maybe providing a little notice.
That's right. Notice
that, right?
That's right.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about it? Are there any other terms that now that we've had that discussion about what should board members pay attention to? Professional development, is that something that should there be something in a superintendent's contract to require that he or she organize governance team training, such as what CSBA would offer? I mean, is that something that makes sense that would go into contracts? Or
Well, I think if that's an important provision for a board, then they ought to embed that in their contract if that's a part of their expectation. Another term that I've seen boards express some interest in more in the last couple of years is notice that the superintendent is looking. And it can be, we want notice when you apply. Now, that's a pretty aggressive provision in a contract. But more typically, it ends up being notice when they're a finalist. That they are now a finalist, have been selected by some other district. It's well within the term, 2 years in, and they have a 3-year agreement. And boards want to know. They want to know that this person that they selected, that they intended to work with for the next 3 or 4 years, if it's a 4-year contract, is seriously out looking.
And I've seen those provisions tied to then what you can get or what a superintendent can receive as compensation if their contract is terminated early. So if you are a finalist and you do let us know and the board does exercise its unilateral termination provision, then you're forfeiting that 18 months or that 6 months because you made this other choice.
You know, the market is so intertwined right now. It's next to impossible for a superintendent to be looking aggressively without people knowing about it. And we tell superintendents all the time that, you know, our searches are confidential until such time that we're going to go meet with the board and present candidates. But we always advise, talk to your board and let them know that you know, you've either been recruited to a position or you're going to make application or it's an opportunity for you to go home. No surprises. Boards do not like to be surprised, and that always ends badly as well.
And finally, the question that will conclude our presentation this afternoon, what happens during contract negotiations? And there's a few elements here. You have to decide on the role of the board, if any. I mean, what has been your experience with respect to just, you know, the search process, the vetting process, the negotiating process? What role should board members play, if any?
Well, I'll start because I think you're working with individual boards, so you've got the experience. When we, as I mentioned before, when we work with a board, we set the parameters. We want to know what the existing contract is, and where is their comfort zone with respect to where it's going. Because as we vet candidates, we're talking ranges with them. It's not limiting, and it doesn't take away the ability for them to negotiate something, but we're honest and forthright, and we say, this is where the board is. You can't go much over that. However, the actual negotiations typically will take place between the counsel of the superintendent and the counsel of the Board of Education, and may or may not include board members in that process.
And I've had board members, like a non-quorum committee, 1 or 2 members of the board who've been assigned to work with legal counsel to hammer out the terms of an agreement based on kind of the parameters set by the board. And it's important at that point for the board to select 2 people who can work well together to give legal counsel some parameters if there are issues with what the board and the negotiations back and forth. I had an unfortunate situation once where one of the board members really wanted to make sure that the superintendent who was coming in would never be able to leave, basically, and he kept trying to hammer in all of these provisions that nobody was going to accept. And so rather than being able to work with those board members to negotiate with superintendent's counsel, we ended up having to call a couple of special board meetings to get further direction from the board. And so you want to be able to limit the special board meetings and still have a good direction from the school board.
Yeah, I think, Maria, is that at the front end, before the negotiation process gets underway in earnest, is the board needs to decide, are they going to delegate an ad hoc committee, non-quorum committee of the board to give guidance to legal counsel who presumably will negotiate the contract itself. And they build in an internal mechanism for reporting back so that the balance of the board is confident about the direction and gets appropriate updates that don't violate the Brown Act as to that process of negotiations. So that's key. You know, the other piece, I think, is for the board to be very careful about its timing. I think some of us may have been in situations where contract negotiation point, and ultimately the candidate who was the finalist departs, and now we have to go to number 2. And while we never want to face that situation, some discussion of that potentiality should occur up front. So what will be our contingency plan if, God forbid, that happens? So it's important to have some of those basic discussions up front as we're going into the negotiation process.
One thing I would say, Roy, you make a great point. It's been my experience that when a board has a 1 and a 1A, that's a little bit more manageable. But when they have a 1 and a clear 2,
Yeah.
that's very difficult and oftentimes results in renewing the search.
Yeah.
So do you quicken your pace? I mean, when you have the differential between the two, how do you respond to that as the consultant?
Well, we so much of what we do is cultivating the candidate to take the position if they get the offer. I mean, that's one of the last things we say to them before we present their names. If offered in this salary range, these compensation parameters, is there anything that will preclude you from taking this position? And, if the answer is, yeah, there are a couple of things, we want to know that going in, and we want, that may very well factor how we recommend our list of finalists, or at least tell the board that, this individual, we're not sure is going to come in for the dollars that you want, but if that's who you want, just know that on the front end. Consultants work for the boards of education. We don't work for the candidates, but we want to avoid what Roy described. I mean, that's a death sentence in the search business, and it really is about the connection that we have with the candidates.
So just to finish up, is there any, in what we've talked about this afternoon from start to finish on this process, when it's an involuntary separation and it's going to happen immediately, do anything that you can at least advise in terms of your experience on how that should handle?
It's another 55-minute
I
discussion.
know, because you got 35 and she has 35. Anything?
Well, I think several things. One is the board would be we would advise the board to look very carefully at why there is this involuntary separation. What were the breakdowns in that process that should inform the process in the next relationship? That would, in however many minutes left, that would be the primary advice I think that we give.
Use it as a learning tool.
Use it as a learning tool.
And then on the practical side, they have to decide who's going to lead the district in the next days. So if a board does exercise the unilateral termination section of a contract, who is staff, is the other administrators going to look up to in the next morning in cabinet or the next week in cabinet? And so you, as an attorney, you need to help them think that through to the next step as well, because sometimes it's whatever caused the involuntary separation may have the board a little off center, and you need to help bring them back and remind them that you need to have somebody else in that place, or somebody else at least take lead of the district.
Great point.
A lot of support in California, School Board Association, Legal Counsel, Administrator Associations in a lot of states. Quickly put the things in place that you need to have in place, but then begin to look at this as a wonderful opportunity to bring in the next leader for your children. That's going to move your district forward, and that's going to be a coming together for the board and the entire administrative cabinet, as well as all of the folks that are employed by the district.
Well, thank you all. I think we could actually go on today, but we are running out of time, so this has been a great discussion. We want to thank our viewers for spending the last hour with us, as well as our presenters for your valuable insights and your firm's ongoing partnerships as CSBA's business affiliates and partners. Finally, this production would not be possible without the hard work of CSBA's communications, IT, and legal teams. If you missed any part of this webcast or would like to tell a colleague about it, it will be available on our website by Friday at www.csba.org. You may contact our presenters if you have any questions via their email addresses that will be posted here in just a minute. Momentarily, you'll be receiving a survey via email. CSBA would appreciate your feedback on our presentation, as well as topic suggestions for future webcast series. So please make sure to take a few minutes to let us know how well we did. Thank you again for joining us today, and thank the panel for this very robust discussion.